Thank you, Matt. Good morning, church family. We are going to get right into it with the first slide. Those who try to make their life secure will lose it, but those who lose their life will keep it. Today, I am going to weave together two stories, that of the life of Thomas Merton and a piece of my own story. In both, we will see what it looks like to find life through losing it. So I was first introduced to Thomas Merton through a faith, prose, and poetry class that I took in college in 2006. And some of our assigned readings came from this book called New Seeds of Contemplation by Thomas Merton, which was published in 1961. It said some beautiful and strange things, like, let's go to the next slide. It said, the only true joy on earth is to escape from the prison of our own false self and enter by love into union with the life who dwells and sings within the essence of every creature and in the core of our own souls. In his love, we possess all things and enjoy fruition of them. Finding him in them all, and thus, as we go about the world, everyone we meet and everything we see and hear and touch, far from defiling, purifies us and plants in us something more of contemplation and of heaven. It also said, one of the paradoxes of the mystical life is this, that a man cannot enter into the deepest center of himself and pass through that center into God unless he is able to pass entirely out of himself and empty himself and give himself to other people in the purity of a selfless love. I am going to tell you up front that at 21 years old, I did not have enough spiritual understanding to glean much of anything from Merton's writings. Even worse, I did not know that I didn't get it. I penciled a number of proclamations in the margin of this book saying things like, Merton is correct, or heresy, as if my opinion was of paramount importance. But for some reason, at the end of the semester, I decided to keep this kind of ugly book. It seemed like it might be worth coming back to at some point, though at the time I had no idea that it was the most important book I had been assigned in college, or that 8 years later, it would be key to the most pivotal season of my life. The author, Thomas Merton, was born in 1915 in southern France. His parents were artists. His father was a painter from New Zealand, and his mother was from America. They had met at a painting school in Paris. When he was 6, his mother died of stomach cancer, and when he was 15, his father succumbed to a brain tumor. By the time he reached adulthood, Merton had lived in France, New York, Bermuda, and England. The young Thomas Merton was intelligent, passionate, and restless. This picture is a copy of his draft registration card from the files that the FBI later kept on him. But I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole this morning. After a short time at Cambridge, the unrest in Europe pushed Merton back across the Atlantic to where his maternal grandparents lived in New York State. He was a smart but wild college student. He spent a lot of time listening to jazz, smoking, drinking, womanizing, and recovering from hangovers. He got a couple of degrees in English from Columbia University and began teaching English at a small Western college in New York. Small college in Western New York. But nothing could satisfy his restlessness. Of that season, Merton wrote in his biography, and there's no slide for this, he wrote, "Here I was, scarcely 4 years after I had left secondary school in England and walked out into the world that I thought I was going to ransack and rob of all of its pleasures and satisfactions. I had done what I intended, and I now found out that it was I who was emptied and robbed and gutted. What a strange thing. In filling myself, I had emptied myself. In 1937, Merton saw in a bookstore window a copy of The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. The title page said that this book was made up of a series of university lectures, and he bought it. But then initially, when he discovered it was a Catholic book, he was so horrified. And I'll say now that he had a deep respect for Catholic culture, but he was scared of the Catholic Church. So when he opened this book up on the train on the way home and discovered it was a Catholic book, he had an impulse to throw it out the window with the passing houses. But he did not. He kept that book. He read part of it, and it profoundly shifted his conception of God. Not long after this, Merton encountered a Hindu monk from India who was living in Chicago. Merton expected this man to recommend Hinduism to him, but instead, this wise man said that Merton should reconnect with his roots, with Christianity, and to read Augustine's Confessions and the Imitation of Christ by Thomas Kempis. Merton's curiosity about spiritual things grew into fervency, and he was baptized as a Catholic in 1938. This next slide is a picture of the Abbey of Gethsemane in the stunning rolling hills of Kentucky. Now, in early 1941, Merton was teaching English to seminarians and football players at a small Franciscan college in Western New York. And he decided to take a retreat here for Holy Week. At the same time he made that decision, his number came up with the draft board. But as it turns out, the army did not want him because he didn't have enough teeth. And so Merton came to Gethsemane. The brother who let him in the dark hours of the morning asked Merton, "Have you come to stay?" Merton replied, oh, no. He later wrote that this question frightened him because it sounded so much like his own conscience. But later in 1941, while he was back in the world, the startling thought came to him. The time has come for me to go and be a Trappist. Trappists, also known as Cistercians, are an order of monastics who practice austerity. They live lives of poverty, silence, solitude, regular fasting, waking up in the middle of the night to pray the hours, and doing manual labor at their monasteries. This second time that Merton passed through the doors of Gethsemane, the same monk asked him, "Have you come to stay?" And this time Merton said, "Yes, brother, if you will pray for me." That was December 10th, 1941, just 3 days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So who did Merton become? He was a Trappist monk, a writer, a theologian, a poet, a social activist, a mystic, a pacifist. Merton was also a scholar of comparative religion and a pioneer of interfaith dialogue. Here, Merton is pictured with the Dalai Lama and Vietnamese monk Thich Nhat Hanh. Merton was committed to mutual listening and learning from many spiritual traditions. Merton wrote more than 50 books in his 27 years of monkhood. And I want to look a little bit more at New Seeds of Contemplation this morning and the impact that this book has had on my life, particularly what Merton writes about a few key concepts. The distinction between the true self and the false self, contemplation, and solitude. However, as I discovered in preparing this message, I would have to talk for at least an hour to develop all of the things that I had hoped to include. So we are only really going to be talking about the true self and the false self this morning. But before we move into that, I want to share with you how Thomas Merton came to matter to me. I'm going to pause there for a drink. So let's jump to 2014 in my life. It had been an intense year for me of deepening connection with God, questioning my evangelical upbringing, a significant mental breakdown, soaring love, crushing loss, and chosen solitude where I could snag it. I'd been learning about practicing silence and solitude and not filling my prayers with words. In October of that year, a friend asked me to house sit while her family was out of town. This was an old house with lots of character, and it had a meditation corner set up with cushions, candles, incense, and a book of common prayer, which at that time was mostly unfamiliar to me. I had never used liturgy before in drawing close to God. I intentionally went into this week planning to take advantage of that sweet little setup. That first night, I lit a candle and some incense. I think I could hear the family dog, Boomer, taking a nap over on the other side of the mostly dark living room. I lay down flat on my back on this bamboo mat that you see. I gave way to silence, as I had done a number of times before. This was a new practice to me. And then something happened. Something that I will never fully have words for. All of a sudden, it was as if I had floated outside of my body. The core of myself felt like it was absorbed into the core of God's self. I was overwhelmed with a sense of oneness with the divine, oneness with all of humanity, past, present, and future, oneness with the earth and all that lives in it. Just unity, peace, and expansion. Then I was back in my body, back within the confines of gravity, pressed against the floor, but nothing was the same. My idea of God had just exploded into this divine union of all things. I remember thinking that if that experience of ecstatic oneness was all that heaven is like, it would be far more than I ever could have imagined. And somehow, God had orchestrated that I had packed this college copy of New Seeds of Contemplation in my duffel bag when I came house sitting. And I just have to emphasize how odd that is, because during that season of my life, the approximate number of books that I was reading each year was 0. But God had sparked something in me in advance to pull that dusty volume off of my bookshelf for this moment. And this book helped me to start understanding what had just happened to me. Out of the mystical experience I had on that bamboo mat in 2014, Merton gave me the words to understand that the person that I had thought of as myself for 29 years was actually a shadow. It turns out that there is an inner spark in me and in each one of you that already exists in union with God. So we're going to talk a little bit about the true self and the false self. Merton writes, every one of us is shadowed by an illusory person, a false self. This is the person that I want myself to be, but who cannot exist because God does not know anything about her. And to be unknown of God is altogether too much privacy. The false self is this person that we think we are. It's our container for our personality, our hobbies, our feelings, motivations, relationships, even our spiritual practices. The false self is not bad. It's good and necessary. It just doesn't go far enough. The problem is when it poses or substitutes for the real thing, the real us. Thomas Merton was the first to suggest the use of the term false self. He did this to clarify the meaning of Jesus' teaching that we must die to ourselves or lose ourselves to find ourselves. Returning to the Gospel of Luke and a different variation of the same teaching, Jesus said to them all, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For those who want to save their lives will lose it, and those who want to lose their life for my sake will save it." I see these passages as talking about the true self and the false self. What we lose and that which remains once we have died to that false self. In Richard Rohr's words, Merton rightly recognized that it was not the body that had to die, but the false self that we do not need anyway. It becomes a too easy substitute for our deeper and deepest truth. So let's start to move into the true self. All sin starts from the assumption that my false self, the self that exists only in my own egocentric desires, is the fundamental reality of life to which everything in the universe is ordered. Therefore, the only one problem on which my existence, my peace, and my happiness depend, to discover myself in discovering God. Next slide, please. If I find God, I will find myself. And if I find my true self, I will find God. The only one who can teach me to find God is God, God's self alone. At that moment, the point of our contact with God opens out, and we pass through the center of our own nothingness and enter into infinite reality, where we awaken as our true self. These are the words that describe what happened to me on that bamboo mat. So what is the true self? The true self is your unknown and undiscovered self that lives in God. It's the eternal part of you. This is the part of us that is hidden with Christ in God. And while it intrinsically exists in each one of us, it can't be found through effort. The awareness of the true self comes as a gift. I know there are too many quotes in here, but Merton says everything's so much better than me, so we've come to this. We only know God insofar as we are known by God. And our contemplation of God is a participation in God's contemplation of God's self. We become contemplatives when God discovers God's self in us. And this sentence is a repeat, but I'm going to read it again. At that moment, the point of our contact with God opens out, and we pass through the center of our own nothingness and enter into infinite reality, where we awaken as our true self. When I began preparing this sermon, I mainly envisioned talking about contemplation and possibly silence and solitude. The bamboo mat was where my contemplative life began. And practicing silence and solitude made that possible. Discovering my true self was a component of that experience, but it was just a piece of my story and a rather small bit of what Merton talks about. I had hoped to say more this morning, or say less about some things so that I could say more about others, but we are St. Thomas. And I spent something ridiculous like 35 hours preparing this sermon. And when it's almost 9 p.m. on a Saturday night, and I've been sick for 8 days, it's just time to set perfectionism aside and be thankful that my church is a community full of grace. So would you pray with me? Beloved divine source, may we believe and may we experience that our deepest selves are already at one with you. Amen.